I grew up in a house where love was always conditional, always just out of reach, handed out in pieces depending on who needed it more that day. And it was never me. My mother had a way of making unfairness sound reasonable. She'd smile while she said it, tilt her head just slightly, and speak in that soft voice that made you feel like arguing would be the problem, not the thing she'd just done. My brother Derek was her masterpiece. Loud, charming, impossible to correct. He could break something and somehow make you apologize for it. My stepfather, Gary, called him a force of nature. My mother called him passionate. What they called me was responsible, which in that house meant you were the one who cleaned up after everyone else without being asked. When I became a federal fraud investigator, they told their friends I worked for the government doing paperwork. My mother said it with a small laugh, like it was a harmless little joke. I didn't correct her. You learn early that some people build their identity around not understanding you. Every Thanksgiving, we did the same thing. Mom cooked too much food. Derek showed up late with wine he definitely expensed to someone else, and Gary sat at the head of the table, nodding at everything Derek said, like a man waiting for applause to start. I'd drive the 2 hours from my apartment in D.C., arrive precisely on time, and spend the next several hours being invisible in the house I grew up in. This past November was supposed to be the same. I'd taken a personal day from the office, packed a bag, and made the drive out to their place in suburban Ohio. The case I'd been building for 8 months, a wire fraud network moving money through shell companies in 3 states, was finally in the final documentation phase. My supervisor, Agent Calloway, had already reviewed the preliminary report. We were close, but family was family, and my mother had called 4 times to confirm I was coming, which meant she needed something from me. And I'd learned that ignoring those calls only made things louder. I want to be clear about why I was there. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had passed in September. The estate was being sorted. There was a house, a small savings account, and a handful of things that needed decisions. My name was in the will, a fact Derek had apparently been furious about since the day the attorney read it. I was there because I was asked, because I owed my grandmother that much, and because I still, despite everything, believed that families could behave like adults when the stakes were real. I arrived at 4 in the afternoon to find Derek's car already in the driveway, which meant he'd been there long enough to settle into the narrative before I walked in. Mom met me at the door with that practiced warmth she reserved for audiences. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so glad you made it." She hugged me briefly, the kind that doesn't reach the back. Derek was in the living room stretched across the couch like he owned the floor plan. He looked up, grinned, and said, "There she is, the government's finest. Still saving the country from bad receipts?" I set my bag down by the stairs. "Still doing better than you," I said. It wasn't mean, it was just true. He laughed too loudly because Derek always laughed too loudly at things that landed wrong. Gary came in from the kitchen, shook my hand the way people shake hands with people they've never quite figured out. "Good drive?" he asked. "Fine," I said. He nodded and went back to wherever he came from. That first evening was manageable. Mom made pot roast. Derek told stories about a business deal he was supposedly closing that would change everything, and Gary refilled everyone's drinks. I sat at the corner of the table and ate and listened, and answered questions with sentences short enough to not invite follow-up. I'd become efficient at that over the years. Take up the minimum space, offer the minimum surface area, survive the meal. After dinner, Derek helped clear the table, which was unusual enough that I noticed it. He even offered to make coffee, which was more unusual still. I watched him move around my mother's kitchen like a man who had already decided how the evening was going to end. Mom sat across from me at the kitchen table, while Derek fussed at the counter. "So," she said, folding her hands, "we've been thinking about Grandma's house." I waited. Derek thinks it makes more sense for him to take it over. He's closer. He could manage the property. I set my fork down. The will splits the house between us equally. She nodded with that patient expression she used when she thought she was being reasonable. "I know, honey, but you have your apartment. You have your career. You don't need the hassle of property in Ohio." Derek turned around from the counter, holding 2 mugs. "Exactly. It's just sitting there. I could actually use it, make it into something. You'd be doing us all a favor." "So what you're asking," I said, "is for me to sign over my half." Derek smiled. "We'd compensate you. Something fair." "Something fair according to whom?" I asked. He set the mugs down. "According to the family." I looked at my mother. She was watching me with that expression she always had right before she said something that sounded kind and wasn't. "Emma," she said, using the tone she reserved for emotional labor, "Derek is going through a hard time. The business has been slow. He needs this more than you do right now." That was the sentence, the one that told me everything about how the next 3 days were going to go. I picked up my coffee. "I'll think about it," I said, which was the most dishonest thing I said all weekend, because I had already thought about it, and my answer was no. The next morning, I went for a run early, before anyone else was up, through the neighborhood I'd grown up in, past the houses that all looked the same now, with their identical seasonal wreaths and their 2-car garages. I needed the air. I needed to think without walls around me. I knew what this was. I'd spent 8 years learning to identify patterns of financial coercion. The setup was almost textbook. Soften the target with familiarity. Appeal to family loyalty. Create an emotional justification for the ask. Apply social pressure through a third party. My mother was the third party, my brother was the architect, and the ask was not small. Grandma's house was worth close to $200,000. My half was $100,000 they were asking me to hand over for something fair, which Derek would define in Derek's favor. The thing about growing up in a house where you're always the responsible one is that you get very good at documentation, not because you're paranoid, because you've learned, slowly and then all at once, that no one remembers things the way they happened. They remember things the way they needed them to happen. I came back from my run, showered, and sent a quick message to my colleague Dana, who worked in our office's estate and financial crimes unit. Nothing formal, just a heads up that I might have a personal matter adjacent to professional territory. She replied with one word, "Noted." That afternoon, the family gathered in the living room to go through some of grandmother's things, boxes of photos, old jewelry, a few small pieces of furniture. My mother presided over it like a quiet auction, holding up items and deciding who they went to with a smile that allowed no argument. When she got to grandmother's jewelry box, she opened it and set it on the coffee table. "There's not much valuable here," she said. "I thought Derek's wife might want a few things." Derek's wife wasn't even there. She was back in Columbus. But the jewelry box was already moving toward Derek's side of the table. I leaned forward. "I'd like to look through it first." Mom paused. "Of course, sweetheart." She slid it toward me, but her smile had gone tight in the corners. Inside was a small gold necklace I'd seen my grandmother wear every Sunday for the first 15 years of my life. It was not valuable by any estate calculation, but it mattered in a way that had nothing to do with appraisals. "I'd like to keep this," I said, holding it up. Derek glanced at it. "Diane might want that one actually. She always admired it." Diane had met my grandmother twice. I closed my hand around the necklace. "It's mine," I said quietly. Mom pressed her lips together. I didn't let go. That night, the house felt different. There was a temperature shift in how Derek spoke to me, a little cooler, a little more careful. Gary stayed in his study after dinner. Mom busied herself with dishes even after they were clean. I sat in the guest room going through my laptop, finishing a section of the fraud report, and told myself I just needed to get through 2 more days. The next morning was Thanksgiving. Mom was up at 6, filling the house with the smell of coffee and roasting things. Derek appeared at 9, looking like a man who'd already had a conversation I wasn't invited to. He was friendlier than the night before, which was the tell. Derek's charm was always transactional. When it showed up without cause, there was a cause. He sat across from me at the kitchen table while Mom worked at the stove. "So," he said, "have you thought more about the house?" I looked up from my coffee. "I have." "And?" "The answer is no, Derek." He tilted his head. "You don't even want it. It doesn't matter what I want. It's half mine, and I'm not giving it up for less than fair market value." He leaned back. "Fair market value." He repeated it like it was a foreign phrase. "You know, Emma, not everything is a transaction." I almost laughed, says the man asking me to give him $100,000. His jaw tightened. Mom set a dish down louder than necessary on the counter. "It's Thanksgiving," she said. "Can we please not do this today?" "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm eating breakfast." Derek stood up. "Fine." He said it the way people say fine when they mean the opposite. "We'll talk later." I watched him leave. I could feel my mother's silence pressing against the back of my neck. The afternoon was a performance. Relatives I saw once a year arrived, filled the house with noise and food-related opinions, and created enough ambient chaos that the tension between Derek and me got absorbed into the general friction of too many people in one space. I smiled. I helped carry dishes. I talked to my aunt about her garden and my cousin about his college applications, and I did all of it with the steady, quiet patience of someone who has learned to wait. It was around 9 in the evening when things shifted. The relatives had gone. The dishes were done. Mom and Gary had retreated to the living room with decaf and the television. Derek found me in the kitchen refilling my water glass and closed the door behind him. He wasn't drunk, but he wasn't completely sober either, and I'd learned over the years that this particular version of my brother was the most dangerous one. Loose enough to say the real thing. Sober enough to mean it. "You know what your problem is," he said, leaning against the counter. "You've spent so long working for the government that you think everything is a case." I turned around. "You asked me to sign away half of my inheritance." I said no. "That's not a case, Derek. That's a conversation." He moved closer. "It's not just about the house. It's about the fact that you always do this. You show up, you stake out your position, you make everything difficult, and then you leave and go back to your perfect little life in DC. Like the rest of us don't exist." I kept my voice level. "That's not what happened. Grandma loved you more," he said, and there it was, the real thing underneath everything else. "You were always her favorite and you know it, and now you're going to use a piece of paper to rub it in." I set my glass down. "I'm not rubbing anything in. I'm following what she wanted." "What she wanted," he repeated with a laugh that had no warmth in it. "You don't know what she wanted. You were barely around the last 2 years." That was not true, but facts had never been Derek's strongest material. I visited her 6 times in the last year of her life. I called every Sunday. But I'd learned a long time ago that when someone was rewriting history, evidence didn't help in real time. "You wrote it down and you waited." Mom opened the kitchen door. "Everything okay?" Derek turned to her. "She won't budge. I'm trying to talk sense into her and she's just standing there like she's interviewing me." I looked at my mother. I said no to signing over my inheritance. That's the whole story. Mom's expression shifted into the one I hated most, the disappointed peacemaker. "Emma, I know you think you're being principled, but your brother is going through a very hard time, and this would mean so much too. So I should give up $100,000 because Derek is going through a hard time." She flinched. "You make it sound so cold." "It is cold," Derek said. "That's the thing about her. Everything is numbers and rules and procedures. You can't have a human conversation with her because she doesn't operate like a human. She operates like a federal agent." I looked at him. "I am a federal agent." He stepped forward. "Then maybe you should leave and go act like one somewhere else." I stood completely still. The kitchen felt smaller than it was. The refrigerator hummed. My mother's hands were clasped against her chest, and Derek was looking at me with something I'd seen in other people's faces across interrogation tables. The look of someone who had decided that if they couldn't get what they wanted, they would take something else. What he did next happened fast. He reached past me. Not toward me, I thought, just reaching for something on the counter. But his arm came across my shoulder with force. Not a shove exactly, more of a hard push that sent me sideways into the corner of the cabinet. The edge caught me across the back of my head. I went down hard, one knee on the tile, the other leg twisting under me. I heard my mother make a sound. Derek stepped back. He said, "You walked into that." I stayed down for a second, not because I couldn't get up. Because I was doing exactly what my training had taught me to do in a volatile situation. Assess, document, don't escalate. I touched the back of my head. My fingers came back with blood, not much, but enough. My mother said, "Oh my God, Emma." She moved toward me. I looked up at Derek. He was very still now. The alcohol was burning off fast, and in its place was something cold and calculating. "It was an accident," he said. "I was reaching for." "Don't," I said quietly. My voice was steady. I was surprised by how steady it was. I got to my feet slowly, keeping one hand on the counter. The back of my head throbbed. Mom was reaching for me, fluttering, saying things I wasn't listening to. I picked up my phone from the counter where I'd set it when I came in for water. "Emma," Mom said, her voice tilting into alarm. "What are you doing?" Exactly what she should have done the first time someone in this house hurt her and got away with it. I wasn't calling 911. I was opening a federal duty application I'd had installed for 2 years and never used outside of work. It was a reporting protocol for federal employees in situations involving assault, domestic threat, or coercion connected to matters under active investigation. I'd had a personal disclosure on file with my office since I'd started looking into the estate issue, a standard conflict of interest form Dana had helped me file. It meant that this house, this weekend, this inheritance dispute was already documented in a federal context. I pressed 3 buttons. A quiet confirmation screen appeared. The report was filed, time-stamped, GPS verified, attached to my open case file. The whole thing took 11 seconds. "What did you just do?" Derek asked. Mom looked at the phone. "Emma, what is that?" I set the phone down on the counter face up. "I have a 4-inch laceration and a report that just went to my duty supervisor." I said it without drama, the same way I'd say it in a debrief. "You have about 40 minutes before someone official arrives, and I'd suggest you think very carefully about the next thing either of you says to me." Derek's face changed. Mom made a small noise. Gary appeared in the doorway in his house slippers, looking confused. "What happened?" No one answered him. I picked up a clean dish towel from the drawer and pressed it to the back of my head. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, because my leg was starting to hurt where I'd landed, and I waited. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in that house since I was 17 years old. My supervisor, Agent Calloway, did not come personally. What came instead was a call, and then 2 county officers who had been requested as a courtesy by the Federal Duty Response Team, and then a woman named Patricia Shields from the Regional Inspector General's office who arrived in a car that made Gary go white in the doorway. Mom had spent the 40 minutes trying to talk me out of whatever she thought I'd done. Derek had gone very quiet and very sober in the corner of the living room. Gary had looked up federal duty reports on his phone, and I'd watched the color slowly drain from his face as he read. I gave my statement in the kitchen while a county officer photographed the back of my head, the blood on the towel, and the corner of the cabinet. I was precise. I gave the time, the position of the people in the room, the sequence of the physical contact, and the exact phrase Derek had said immediately afterward. I did not editorialize. I did not cry. I answered every question the same way I would answer questions about evidence in a wire transfer case, because that is what I'd been trained to do, and because losing composure in that kitchen, in front of those people, was something I had decided I was not going to do. Agent Shields spoke to Derek separately. Mom sat in the living room with her hands folded like a woman in a waiting room, which in a way was exactly what she was. When the county officers were done with me, Agent Shields came back to the kitchen. "Miss Calloway," she said, using my last name the way officials do when they want to create appropriate distance. "The incident report is complete. Given that you have an active disclosure on file and the matter intersects with an estate dispute already noted in your personal conflict registry, this will be reviewed by our office." She paused. "The individual involved may be contacted for formal follow-up." "I understand," I said. "You should also know," she said, "that the statements given by the other parties in the house are being noted. Inconsistencies will be relevant." My mother had told the officers she hadn't seen exactly what happened. Derek had said it was an accident, that he'd been reaching for something, that I'd been in the way. The inconsistencies were already piling up. I spent that night in my car, not because I was afraid, but because I was done being inside that house pretending it was a reasonable place to be. I reclined the seat, pulled a blanket from the back, and sent a short message to Dana. She replied within 2 minutes. "I know. Shields already copied me." "You okay?" I replied. "Fine." She sent a thumbs up and then, after a pause, "Eat something." In the morning, I drove to a diner 2 miles from the house, ordered eggs and coffee, and sat in a booth by the window while the sun came up over a Denny's parking lot in suburban Ohio, and I thought about my grandmother. I thought about the way she used to put her hand on the back of my head when I was little, the exact spot that was now sore and bandaged. I thought about how she used to say, in her particular quiet way, that the people who shout the loudest are usually the ones with the least to say. I'd thought she meant it philosophically. I understood now that she'd spent 60 years in a family that kept proving it. I went back to the house once to collect my bag. Mom met me at the door. She looked like she hadn't slept. Derek's car was gone. "Emma," she started. "I need to get my bag," I said. "Please." She touched my arm. "Can we just talk?" I looked at her for a long moment. I had 100 things I could have said. I'd been saving them up for years, carefully organized, indexed, ready. But I realized, standing on that porch in the November cold with a bandage on the back of my head and my car running in the driveway, that I didn't want to spend them here. "There'll be a process," I said. "You'll receive communications from Agent Shield's office. I'd suggest you engage with that process honestly." Then I went inside, got my bag, and left. The drive back to DC took 2 hours and 14 minutes. I listened to a podcast about something completely unrelated to any of this. When I got to my apartment, I fed my cat, made tea, and finished the final 2 pages of my fraud report. The following weeks moved the way official processes move, which is to say deliberately and without drama, which is exactly how they're supposed to move. Agent Shield's review found Derek's statements inconsistent with both the physical evidence and with Gary's account, which had quietly shifted once Gary understood that inconsistency carried its own risks. My mother's claim that she hadn't seen exactly what happened was noted in the record, but not contested. She was not charged. That wasn't the point. Derek was referred to the county prosecutor's office for misdemeanor assault. His attorney called me twice. I directed both calls to Agent Shields. The estate matter was taken up separately by a civil attorney I hired in November, a woman named Rosa Chen who specialized in contested estates and who had the particular energy of someone who enjoyed being underestimated. By February, the house had been formally appraised. Derek's claim to my half was reviewed by the probate court. He had no legal basis for any of it. The will was the will. My grandmother had been clear, and she had been competent, and she had known exactly what she was doing. The house sold in March. My portion of the proceeds arrived in my account on a Tuesday, which I remember because I was in the middle of a briefing when my bank sent the notification, and I looked at it once and then put my phone back down and kept talking about the fraud case, which was also, separately, going very well. I did not attend Derek's hearing. I submitted a written victim impact statement instead. Rosa walked me through the language. I kept it factual. Time, location, injury, impact. No performance, no appeal for sympathy. Just the record, stating what the record stated. The judge's comments, which my attorney forwarded to me in an email with the subject line "Thought you'd want to see this," noted that the evidence was consistent and the defendant's account was not. A fine was issued. A restraining order was granted, not because I feared my brother in any ongoing way, but because I'd learned that formal boundaries were the only kind that lasted. Mom called the week after the hearing. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was long and careful, full of the kind of language that people use when they're not quite apologizing but want credit for the effort. She said she knew things had gone wrong. She said she loved me. She said she hoped I could find it in my heart to not let this define us. She said Derek was struggling and that she hoped I could have compassion. I listened to the voicemail once and then archived it. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. I understood finally and without bitterness that my mother would always love Derek and me equally in her own accounting. She would always see his struggle as more urgent than my injury. She would always choose the narrative of family togetherness over the narrative of what actually happened. That was not going to change, and I was not, any longer, going to exhaust myself expecting it to. What I had instead was this: a clean apartment, a cat who met me at the door, a case that closed in April with 4 indictments and a commendation from the division director. A colleague named Dana who sent me a plant when the estate settled and wrote on the card, "For your office, because you clearly need something alive near you." A promotion that came through in May, which I'd been working toward for 2 years, and which had nothing to do with Thanksgiving and everything to do with 8 months of documented work on a fraud network that had been laundering money in plain sight. I kept my grandmother's necklace. I wear it sometimes when I think about her, which is more often than I expected. She would have understood, I think. She was the kind of woman who kept her own records, who remembered everything and said very little and waited for the right moment with the patience of someone who had learned, the hard way, that timing mattered more than volume. She'd lived in a loud family her whole life, and she'd known which parts of herself to protect. She knew I'd understand eventually. The case file for my brother's assault sits in a county courthouse in Ohio. It will be there for the required number of years, and then it won't be there anymore, and none of that particularly matters to me. What matters is that it was written down, correctly, in the official language, at the correct time, by the correct people. That when someone asked what happened, there was an answer that did not depend on who was in the room or who was louder, or who had always been the favorite. The truth doesn't need to raise its voice when it's been properly documented. That's something I used to know only professionally. Now I know it personally too. which is a harder lesson and a better one. My grandmother left me $100,000, a gold necklace, and 60 years of proof that quiet people can outlast the noise. I think I finally understand what she was trying to tell me.